We'll be talking today about human anatomy and physiology, the study of the structure and function of the amazing human body. Today's discussion will be part 2 of treatment of chapter 4 of our text. And in this chapter, we're looking at or surveying all the different tissue types that make up all the organs and organ systems in our body. We started out in chapter 1, or in part 1, I'm sorry, of this chapter, chapter 4, looking at some epithelial tissues, and we have a few more epithelia to examine, and then we'll move into connective tissues in this section. So far we looked at simple squamous epithelia, simple cuboidal epithelia, and simple columnar epithelia. How we come to kind of an exception in terms of that organizational scheme, this epithelium has apparently multiple layers. If we look at this beautiful micrograph, we can see what appears to be layers of nuclei, and so this is called a pseudostratified epithelium because careful histology has identified that each one of these cells of the epithelium do in fact contact the basement membrane, the sort of dense mat of proteins that the epithelial cells all create and to which they're anchored, and then from there down into the tissue beneath. So there's a pseudostratified columnar epithelium, and in addition, it's ciliated. And we already discovered microvilli on the surface of the intestinal epithelium to increase the surface area for transporters to allow us to capture all the nutrients from our diet. These similar-looking appendages are actually motorized whips. They can use ATP and a complex microtubule structure to whip along in a repetitive way, which will serve the purpose of transporting a layer of mucus which resides on the surface up and out of the airways of the lungs. So this epithelium lines your trachea, your bronchi, and all the branches, most of the branches down to the very smallest airways in your lungs. And there's a layer of mucus that captures dust and debris and bacteria and so forth in this sticky mucus layer, and then it's swept out of the lungs to be swallowed down into the stomach, into the seething cauldron of acid that is the stomach, where most of those bacteria will be dispatched. So also there's a similar epithelium in the nasal cavity which will sweep all the debris that is captured there posteriorly to be swallowed down. So we have this protective epithelium of the respiratory system. Okay, so now we go back to our organizational scheme and we look at a stratified epithelium for the first time. This epithelium has more than one layer, hence it's automatically characterized as a stratified as opposed to a simple epithelium. And here is the basal layer of this epithelium, the cells that are actually attached to the basement membrane, which again is in turn connected to deeper tissues, connective tissues of your body. And the surface of this epithelium is in this case, is the hollow lumen of the esophagus. But we can see that there's many, many layers of cells here, and that's what gives this its name stratified. But also, if we look towards the surface of this epithelium, the apex of it, the apical surface, the cells are very flat and thin, as evidenced by the squashed nuclei, and those are squamous cells, so we call it a stratified squamous epithelium, even though the cells down here, the basal layer, or several basal layers, are not flat at all. They may look more like cuboidal cells. So down here in the basal layer, the cells are dividing. There are stem cells there that divide occasionally, giving rise to daughter cells that will divide frequently and rapidly to produce a large population of cells that will then be pushed upwards superficially, and then as the cells rise away from that basal layer, they will begin to differentiate or mature into these squamous cells and ultimately be sloughed out at the surface. So this is a protective epithelium that can protect the body, the organ, from abrasion. When we swallow food, we swallow solid materials, which is kind of a violent process in this muscular tube. We force them down into the stomach, and so some cells are stripped off the surface in so doing. No problem, there's plenty more coming in from behind where those came from. So it's an epithelium designed to withstand friction. So this is the esophagus. There's essentially an identical looking epithelia that lines the vagina. Another organ that is subject to friction. Normal function is subject to friction, and the epithelium can protect it. And also in the anus, the process of defecation is quite a violent process in which solid material is forced through a muscular opening, and so we have this epithelium that can withstand that kind of friction. So now let's move on to look at a specialized and even more specialized stratified squamous epithelium. And this epithelium is similar in that there is a basal layer of cells which contains stem cells and dividing cells, which then gives rise to some layering of cells going further and further into the superficial as we go up towards the surface. But in this case, the last stage of maturation of this epithelium involves cells dying, and we wind up with multiple layers of cells that have already died, but they're tough cells packed with an impervious protein called keratin and stitched together by many desmosomes. And there's more to it than that, but the point is these are tough layers, protective layers of the outside of the skin, the surface of the body, that protects us from bacteria getting into the body, fungi, chemicals, and all kinds of nasty materials. And it also keeps water from escaping. This epithelium in its most superficial layers is also invested with a lot of lipids that waterproof essentially this outermost part of this epithelium and keep water in our body so we don't dry out all the time. So this is called the epidermis. The outer part of the skin is the boundary part of the skin. The thickest part of the skin, as we'll see, is structural and supportive and tough and so mechanically tough. This is the boundary, the seal on the surface of our body that protects us from the environment and keeps our moisture in. It's called a keratinized stratified squamous epithelium because of the densely packed keratin intermediate filaments that are found in these outermost layers of dead cells. Here comes another exception to our organizational scheme. It's called a transitional epithelium. And when we look at this epithelium, it defies apparently any organizational arrangement of the cells. It's a stratified epithelium, but the cells just look like a jumbled pile of cells stacked upon one another. The point of this epithelium is to allow the bladder to expand, and when it's empty it occupies very little volume, but as the urine begins to accumulate, the kidneys never stop making urine, the bladder expands greatly. And the epithelium that lines the bladder and the ureters, the tubes that carry urine to the bladder, need to be able to expand along with that muscular container, that muscular hollow organ. And so this epithelium in this picture is all bunched up because it's a contracted situation. The bladder is empty, and if we saw how it looked when the bladder was full, it would be pulled out much thinner and it would look nice and straight, and the cells would kind of be all tugged out into a different sort of orientation. It's sort of analogous to an elastic waistband in your garment. It looks all bunched up and puckered when it's not stretched, but then when you stretch it out, it's all smooth and flat and tight, and that's kind of what happens when the bladder expands. So the transitional epithelium is peculiar to that organ. We already saw, I jumped ahead a couple slides, we already saw that exocrine glands are composed of simple cuboidal epithelial cells. The secretory units, or acini, of an exocrine gland are composed of simple cuboidal cells. They produce a secretion product and then secrete that product into ducts, which coalesce into larger and larger ducts and eventually release the secretion product onto the surface of the body. Digestive juices from the pancreas enter the duodenum. We said that's essentially effectively outside the body, the inside of the intestine. Sweat glands release sweat right onto the surface of the epidermis in order to allow for evaporative heat loss. Mammary glands produce milk. So we have some examples of exocrine glands that secrete through ducts onto the surface of the body, and their secretory units, the cells that make up those glands, are simple cuboidal cells. Here's a picture, or a cartoon I should say, of a secretory acinus of an exocrine Another type of gland, which is also, these are specialized epithelial cells, I should say. Another type of gland cell that's a specialized epithelial cell is a goblet cell, and we find goblet cells interspersed among simple columnar epithelial cells and among pseudostratified columnar epithelial cells. These are single-celled glands that also produce mucus that can contribute to that layer of mucus on the surface of the tissue. In this case, it's microvilli of the intestinal wall. It could have been cilia in the trachea, and some of that mucus that's protective on the surface of the epithelium comes from goblet cells. The further down the digestive tract we go, and if we examine the epithelium, where there's firmer and firmer contents of the organs, we find that there are more and more goblet cells when more and more mucus is needed to lubricate the stiffening chyme that's found in the large intestine, for example. The exocrine glands themselves have multiple mechanisms by which they release their products. So again, these are specialized simple cuboidal epithelial cells. In this case, the epithelial cells will release their secretory product by exocytosis. You can see some vesicles in the cells filled with the product that's already been synthesized, and upon the appropriate stimulus, those vesicles will fuse with the cell membrane and will have secretion. Exocytosis, a type of active transport. In the case of a holocrine gland, such as a sebaceous gland, we see essentially a stratified epithelium of secretory gland cells, but in this case, the cells rupture as they mature and contain more and more of the secretory product, and eventually they just burst and release all of that secretion, which will eventually wind up on the surface of the skin. It'll enter into a hair follicle and then out onto the surface of the skin to soften and lubricate the skin and the hair shafts, so that your skin is nice and supple and the hair shafts don't chafe and break off. So that's called holocrine secretion, because the entire cell is sacrificed and more cells come up from behind and replace those cells and continue to secrete or produce more and more of the secretory product. Okay, so I hope you've gotten some good new knowledge as we studied the epithelial tissues of your body. We've come a long way through our list of tissues, believe it or not, and now we're going to look at connective tissues. So that's the second of four major categories of tissues that make up all your organs and organ systems. So whereas epithelial tissue is largely cellular, it's just sheets of cells stitched together by cell-cell junctions that anchor to the basement membrane and beyond, connective tissues have resident cells, but they're relatively scarce, and the majority of the tissue, the material, is the extracellular matrix. These resident cells can synthesize and secrete a complex extracellular matrix comprising protein fibers. Each one has some kind of protein fibers that we can identify, and then something else that occupies the space around all those fibers called the ground substance. It's just a catch-all term for whatever it is that we find out there around the protein fibers in a particular connective tissue. So each time we look at a tissue, remember to be paying attention to identify the resident cell type, any other cells that may be present, and what kind of protein fibers they are. There are a few different proteins which may be present, and what is it about the ground substance that contributes to the overall properties of the tissue. Several of the connective tissues that we'll study have essentially the same makeup. The majority of the material is the same kind of protein fibers, but the ground substance varies greatly, and so the tissues have almost nothing in common at a glance. All right, so our first subcategory of connective tissue proper is called, or connective tissue is called connective tissue proper, and there are three types of connective tissue proper. Before we look at that, we're going to look quickly at the structure of the major component of the ground substance in connective tissue proper. Proteoglycans. They're the coolest thing ever. They're a long polysaccharide backbone to which is affixed peptide chains, sort of mini proteins, and then to each one of those mini proteins are many chondroitin sulfate, for example, proteoglycans. These are separate. I guess this whole thing is called a proteoglycan. These little side chains are glycosaminoglycans. There's what I'm searching for. And so these are just short sugar chains and they tend to be very, very negatively charged, electrically charged. So we have this enormously complex molecule, which has a molecular weight in the millions, if you can imagine such a thing, made up of a polysaccharide core, protein sequences, protein chains, to which are affixed many, many glycosaminoglycans with electric charges. So that's a proteoglycan. The thing about a proteoglycan is because it's so charged and so huge and complex, it hydrates a lot of water. So when this thing is exposed to water, it clings to a lot of water molecules by virtue of its charge and the partial charges on the hydrogens of the water molecule. And so we have almost like a gel. So it makes the tissues pliable, gives them some sort of density, but yet they're pliable. So this is just some summary slides you can use for yourself when we're going back and studying the various types of connective tissues, the connective tissue propers, and we'll actually start getting into those connective tissue propers in the next part. I don't want to make these too long. I'll allow you to have a short little session of studying for this chapter. So in the very next session, we'll go right into all the types of connective tissue, and then we'll finish out with muscle tissue and nervous tissue.